Welcome to the Educational Research section of www.happynumbers.org. We're going to continue our work with single subject research designs, and today's video will deal with a design called the changing criterion design. So far there are videos on the AB design, single case design, the multiple baseline single case design, and a variation of the multiple baseline, the multiple probe single case design. So this is a fourth design. Again, these single case designs were developed when there was a lack of a large sample to be able to divide up into experimental and control groups. And so these designs, although they do not use random sampling or any kind of sampling, they are true experimental designs, and they can develop good internal validity or establish experimental control. Well, let's take a look at a typical graph in a changing criterion design. Notice down here, this is the sessions right here. Let's say the number of days that we're collecting data right down here. And on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the number of cigarettes smoked. So we're going to help someone quit smoking. And so here we have the number of cigarettes smoked and the number of days. And notice that there is a baseline condition. This line right here is the baseline. But then notice there are phases in this design. These dotted lines represent different phases. All right, so here's the research. We're going to help someone to quit smoking, and we're going to use an intervention. Let's say the intervention will be a $50 reward for reaching each criterion level. So let me explain how the design works. First was a description of the design. The changing criterion design evaluates the effects of an intervention or an independent variable when it is applied in a stepwise fashion. Stepwise. The dependent variable, in this case our dependent variable is the number of cigarettes smoked, must already be part of the subject's behavioral repertoire. Therefore, this design, the changing criterion design, is not good for teaching new skills. Let's take a look at the conditions. The changing criterion design consists of two conditions: a baseline condition, where there is continuous observation of the dependent variable. So let's click on the baseline, and there is our baseline, and our baseline is stable in terms of level and trend. So the concept of baseline logic would kick in. And if we didn't intervene, then the amount of cigarettes smoked would stay about the same. Okay, so a baseline condition and then an intervention condition applied across multiple phases. So from here all the way over, this is all the intervention, and each one of these is a phase of the intervention. And you'll notice that the phases are in different lengths or different amounts of days. This phase goes from about 5 to 9. This phase goes from about 9 to 19. This phase goes about 19 to 25. This goes from about 25 to 34 and 34 to 40. And this is done by design so that each phase is not exactly equal in length. So here are the steps. A series of levels are established, criterion levels. So the researcher, prior to the research, establishes sort of subjectively criterion levels. So here the researcher says, okay, so we took baseline data, now we're going to intervene, and so the first phase we're going to ask you to come down to only smoke 22 cigarettes. And if you're successful, then we're going to drop the criterion down to 16 cigarettes. And if you're successful, then we're going to drop the criterion down to 12 cigarettes. And if you're successful, then we're going to drop it down to 4 and then to none. So the researcher subjectively defines criterion levels. And if criterion is reached treatment is applied to the next phase, and so on through the phases. So if the criterion is reached in the first phase, then we move on and apply treatment to the second phase and the third phase and the fourth phase and the fifth phase. So 2 conditions, baseline condition and then an intervention condition applied across multiple phases. And the dotted lines indicate the phases, and the horizontal lines here are the criterion levels. So let's go into phase 1, and so here's what the design would look like. So phase 1, okay, and the intervention is a financial incentive of $50 for each phase. So if the participant reaches the first criterion level of 22 cigarettes, then they're given $50. That's the intervention. And if they reach the second one, they're given 50, and so on. So in the first phase, the data has stabilized in terms of level and trend around the criterion level. So then we go to phase 2. And again, the data has stabilized around the criterion level. Go to phase 3. Again, it's come down, moved in a therapeutic direction, and stabilized at around the criterion level. Phase 4, it's stabilized around the criterion level, and then finally phase 5, and there. So this particular data, the way it is pictured here, establishes very good experimental control. It has very good internal validity. So let's take a look at internal validity. Experimental control, or internal validity, is demonstrated by progressive changes in the performance of the dependent variable. In our case, the dependent variable was the amount of cigarettes smoked. And it is strengthened by immediate and abrupt change in the participant's performance. And in all phases, we did have an immediate and fairly abrupt change. Participants' performance coincides with the criterion level set by the researcher. Well, the data did stabilize in level and trend around the criterion levels, and the data points stabilize around the criterion level established. So we've met those 3 conditions. So the way this particular research is graphed, the way it looks here, this has very good experimental control. Let's take a look at the advantages. This is a simple way to establish internal validity or experimental control. The treatment, or the independent variable, is applied throughout the entire research except for the baseline. So the treatment is available to the person throughout all of the phases. It's appropriate for evaluating gradual changes in behavior. It really limits the threats of maturation and history. Those are threats to internal validity. Actually, there is a video called Threats to Internal Validity, or Internal Validity, and if you haven't looked at that, you ought to look at that so you'll understand what maturation and history are. And it ends on an intervention, because the intervention is always applied. And this is a very simple design to use in a classroom for homework, increasing homework performance, all kinds of different ways it can be used. Some disadvantages: it's limited to dependent variables that already are in the subject's behavioral repertoire. It's limited to dependent variables that can be gradually modified. There are maybe some ethical questions about an extended period of time that it takes. This took 40 sessions, and if it were days, it would be 40 days. Another disadvantage is it requires the investigator or the researcher to subjectively define criterion levels. And finally, like any one single case design, it has limited external validity. Let's take a look at this design again. I'm going to just shoot back. Okay, here's how it works. Baseline, we take baseline data, that's the first condition, and then the next are a series of phases, that is the intervention condition. And we're looking for the data to reach the criterion and stabilize around it. And here it does, here it does, here it does, here it does, and here it does. So we can say with a high degree of probability that it is probably the independent variable, the financial incentive of $50 for each phase, for completing each phase, caused the change in the dependent variable, the amount of cigarette smoke. We've established very good experimental control. This has very good internal validity. Let's just take a look at a different design. So before we had cigarette smoking, and so we were having behaviors move in a therapeutic direction down to 0. But here we have homework problems completed. So let's say we have a student and we're giving them 30 problems for homework, and they're not doing any because it's too many problems. So we take some baseline data and we see they're completing almost nothing. So the data has stabilized. So we know it's reached its natural level in the environment, and so now we're going to intervene. And so we've set our criterion levels. So first we want to complete 4 homework problems, then 10, then 18, then 22, and then all 30. And again, notice the phases are different in length, and the criterion levels are not exactly the same, and that's all done to strengthen the internal validity also, to establish experimental control. So phase 1, okay, the intervention, access to 10 minutes computer time at the end of class. Phase 1, the homework completion has stabilized around the criterion level, so we move to phase 2. Again, it has stabilized around the criterion level, so that was successful, so we go to phase 3. And again, each time the participant is reaching the criterion level and the data is stabilizing, they're having the access to the computer time. Phase 4, same thing, and finally in phase 5. So here again, this has very, very good internal validity. We can say with a high degree of probability here that access to 10 minutes computer time at the end of class has increased this participant's number of homework problems completed correctly. Good. Let's go back here for a minute. Take a look at an example. If you're interested in seeing what a changing criterion design looks like in a piece of research, here is a citation for you. You can put the video on pause if you're interested, and you can copy that down. And you can get a hold of that journal through the university databases and take a look at that. Okay. And that's it. That's it for a changing criterion design. Very simple, very good to use in a classroom. You might consider, if you're working with us at the university, of doing a changing criterion design for your master's thesis. Well, thank you very much. See you next time.